Bit of a smaller crowd today, but thanks for making it here. So today we're going to just cover a bit of a recap of what we went through the year and some of the recent changes that are happening, shifts in the market and what we're seeing out there. So let's start off with a November 2024 total residential market update. So just some general trends you can see on the screen here. You can see the months in inventory have been going up. So compared to this time last year, we're about a little over 40% higher as far as inventory goes. The number of sold listings or sales haven't gone up dramatically, so they're about the same as last year, a little under 1%. However, you will notice that days on market are trending up, so they're 26% higher than where they were last year. And part of it's because the market is starting to shift and things are just taking longer to sell. We're seeing some signs where people are having to do price drops to get their properties sold. So this is a more detailed breakdown. So on the left of the screen, we have detached. On the right, we have semi-detached. Main thing to focus on would be months of inventory. The semi-detached is still a very tight space as far as inventory goes. So you see 6.8% gain in inventory for semi-detached. But if you look at investment properties specifically, or those with basement suites, they're just a fraction of that. So there's still very little inventory. In fact, I was looking this morning, we have about 5 decent options that I would consider recommending to clients in all the city. That is not a new build. Okay, and then this is the row house and apartment space breakdown. Again, interesting one to note would be the months of inventory in the apartment space. Compared to this time last year, we're up almost 120%. And where we see that going is it's probably going to just keep going up and up and up because we have a ton of apartment buildings under construction. Right now, I believe there's about 15 projects downtown that are underway for apartment towers, and those are probably going to hit the market in the next 3 to 5 years. So what's essentially happened is we noticed that there was a shortage of housing, and then all these builders started building, but then now the market, we're now entering a different market, but all those units are still going to flood the market a few years down the road. So rents are also changing. It's not the way it used to be. You put your property on Rent Faster or Facebook Marketplace and you get flooded with 100 inquiries. I think those days are, for the most part, gone. I just picked this specific example of 2-bedroom basement suites in Calgary. I didn't put any other filters, so it's just across the entire city. Between 2023 and 2024, there's about a 70% increase in inventory. And if you look at year 2022 to 2023, same time period, it was actually 278% increase. So you can see over here, December 11, 2023, last year, we had 410 listings. Right now, we have 698 listings. And the year before, we only had 147. Okay? And you can see where prices are roughly 50th percentile is roughly around the $1,400. And kind of the peak there is about $1,700. And then 3-bedroom main floors. And I picked this because most properties that are suited up down typically have a 3-bedroom main floor. If you have a bungalow or a 2-story, they're typically 3-bedroom houses, so I went with this. The inventory increase is not as bad as the basement suites, but still 51% year over year. But the year before is also an astonishing 259%. So a big chunk of where all this inventory is coming is new builds, mainly in the suburbs of Calgary. Especially with the basement suites, most new builds are coming with basement suites from the builder. That's adding a lot of supply. And I didn't do a price breakdown here by age or anything like that because it's hard to get precise data from Rent Faster. But if we were to look at that data, you will notice that the suburb basement suites have taken a much bigger rent hit than something inner city or in an established neighborhood. Because the problem is in the suburbs, you're just competing with each other for similar units, and the only thing you can compete on is price because you all have identical units on the same street, right? So rent price trends, you can see price trends for a 3-bedroom main floor here. So rent started to noticeably start dropping around September is kind of the inflection point when rents started going downhill. And do we see that continuing? I would say yes, because there's still lots of supply being built. And then it's going to take a while for all that to hit the market. That being said, I think 3-bedroom main floor rents will still be more resilient as opposed to 1 or 2-bedroom basement suite rents in the long run. So let Layne cover this part.
I guess rents are coming down, and that's a lot of that is due to us not having rent control. So when rents went up, they went up drastically as everything got kind of compressed, and then investors started making more money. So investors started building and buying more rental properties and putting suites in their existing property. So the rent control does what, the market is doing what it's supposed to do. So there's demand and money to build rentals. So that's what happened. And that's why you see Ontario getting, and Quebec even worse so, with a massive demand for new, rents or rental properties, and yet they can't build anything. So they need all this new housing, and yet no matter how many incentives they offer and what they do, they cannot convince anyone to build. So it's actually, the rent control is doing what it's supposed to do, and it's going to stabilize our market, which is good because our economy has been doing a great job at diversifying since oil and gas kind of crashed in 2014-15. And now even since it's recovered, oil and gas employment really hasn't recovered, and all of our employment is in new, fintech. One of the things we reviewed a lot of this year is how we got our tech sector became the 12th fastest growing in the world out of nowhere. And a lot of it was to do with the oil and gas industry in Alberta isn't just drillers and roughnecks, it's very technical. So there's chemical engineers, environmental engineers, and structural engineers. Like a lot of what we need to get the oil and gas that we have, especially out of the oil sands, requires a lot of educated people. So those people already had math or science degrees. They already knew how to code. It was already part of their existing job. And it was really easy to switch them over into tech, including fintech. And then we got aerospace, which doesn't make any sense. We don't have an aerospace industry, and we don't have manufacturing. It's that they decided, and this is de Havilland, when they decided to consolidate, move their head office here, build a new research facility here and manufacturing here, just out of nowhere, with no base to start from, because it's a good place to do business, and they recognize that. The other thing that's been a bonus for us is all the leftover office space that was being built for oil and gas that was never ended up being needed. There's more empty commercial office space in Calgary than there is total in Vancouver. So we had all that leftover space, the number 2 in Canada behind Toronto. And that space shows anyone that's going to expand here, any company that's going to expand here, whether they're from Southeast Asia or whether they're from the United States or even other Canadian companies looking to either expand or to move, this is a good place to do business. Their rent's going to be cheap for their commercial space. They can pay their employees a reasonable wage and they can still go out and buy a house. Those are the things that are going to help keep our economy strong. So, of course, as a real estate owner, of course I want prices to double, but I also know that wouldn't be healthy for our long-term economy. So the ups and downs of our market go up and down a lot more, but what you're seeing in Ontario is their market took 15 years just going up. And when it corrects, it's going to be very painful. And they're starting to see the leading edge of that, but they're not even close to getting through the correction that they're about to feel. So that is one of the reasons it's happening. The couple of reasons I see is say, don't panic. The rent prices are probably about 10% down from the peak. I think they're probably going to drop another 10. I think we're going to be 20, even maybe 25% off the peak. But the peak was kind of a short-lived peak. We're going to end up at about early 2023 prices, which is still 50% up from what they were a few years prior to that, and for the subsequent 10 years prior to that as well. So I don't think it's something we have to be worried about. Obviously, you have to do your numbers and you have to make sure your cash flow works, but you shouldn't, the idea is that buying rental properties or real estate investing. I advocate, I'm not a big flipper. Most people, if you've seen any of our stuff before, you know that I do not like house flipping. I don't even consider it real estate investing. It's a different business that involves real estate, but it's not real estate investing. So you should be looking at a 10 to 20 year horizon with your real estate investments anyways. So what rents do in a 6 to 12 to even 18-month period isn't really as relevant compared to the long term. Of course, you can't ignore it because it does impact your cash flow and your capacity to qualify as well. The other thing that's kind of offsetting that is the rent. So whether if you took a short term, a 3-year, or you're in a variable, you're going to have your rates go down too. So with your rates decreasing, it's going to help offset some of the rents that are likely going to come backwards as well. So just to be clear, a lot of people probably haven't experienced the rent drop yet. So it's only if you've had to re-rent something in the last 3 or 4 months that you've even noticed that the rents kind of aren't peaking, because it was still pretty easy in the summer, less so than last year, but it was still easy to re-rent. But in December, it changed. And then I actually had a couple of properties that went vacant through for a full month, which I haven't had happen in a decade, basically. As long as I was on top of it, I was able to get everything re-rented right away. I actually had a few properties that were vacant for over, the tenant moved out and I didn't have someone already ready to move in. So I actually spent a month vacated a couple of my properties that I rented later in the fall. So I guess one of the things, you want to make sure you have a good property. And a good property is still going to cash flow or even break even if you're trying to buy a good property in a neighborhood that also has some good potential, especially if that potential's within the next 5 years. So for redevelopment. So if you're buying a bungalow with a basement suite on a 6,000 square foot lot in a neighborhood where there's already infills being built or fourplexes or eightplexes being built, then you're likely going to pay kind of a higher price compared to what you could get, maybe another further 10 minutes out. So and those are kind of things you have to gauge, whether you want to have just cash flow or whether you want some future potential upside as well, and how far away that future is. So when you look at the way to look at housing, it doesn't matter. Like I guess you don't want the current market and what's going to happen in rents in the next 6 months or 12 months or even 18 months impact whether you're going to continue to invest in real estate. And you also don't want to stop and wait for real estate investing, because by the time you've realized now it's time to invest, it was 3 months ago. So by the time the stats actually hit and you can see the market's turning, it's already turned. And we've seen people do that. We saw them do that in early 2022. There was kind of a shift because the Toronto market had just started crashing and everyone was hesitant here. Everyone stopped. And that's when they should have been buying. Incidentally, that's the only time I've ever done a flip. Because the market was just came to a halt. And everyone was like, well, I just want to wait and see how things play out. But by the time they were like, okay, I'm comfortable now, prices had gone up. Like it was like easily 5 in some cases 10%, because it was also over Christmas, which adds a bit of a weird dynamic to the market. Sometimes good opportunities can get missed. And yeah, there was probably a 10% drop in there, where if you would have purchased, then you would have gotten a really good deal. Now a deal doesn't matter. My best house I overpaid for, I was in competing offers for, and I overpaid for it in competing offers in a down market. This was in the latter half of 2007. So that was kind of like the original, peak, 15 plus years ago. So that property has a great basement suite, great location, 3-bedroom main floor. It's on a corner, has a really nice side deck, really nice yard setup. It's on a corner, so there's always room for parking. It's across from a park. And then there's an oversized heated double garage and an oversized single garage. So renting and cash flow has never been a problem, even in the worst of the markets. Really, really easy to cash flow. So I overpaid for that house. If I would have waited 6 months to buy that house, like if it had been listed 6 months later, I think I paid $412 for it, and I probably could have got it for $400 or $398. And the problem is it wouldn't have been there. It would have been sold, right? So my best property, purchased in 2007, is, so now 17 years ago. It's been always a good cash flower for me, always easy to rent. And I would have missed it if I was trying to time the market. And because I'm not flipping, it doesn't really matter. I haven't sold it. So it doesn't really matter that much. What matters is that it's a good property. So when the market's good, it's actually harder to buy, but you should never not buy because the market's good and you're getting in competing offers, because if you're ready to buy, you should buy when you first find a deal that works. Doesn't mean you should overpay. You should just continue to look for a property that fits your criteria and then buy it when you find it. And also in a down market, the same thing applies. It's almost like dollar cost averaging in real estate. So the market's likely going to be rough this year, but we don't want to scare people away from buying. You have to take the cash flow into consideration. And if you're really dependent on cash flow, or if you've got into some highly leveraged deals where you're already flat or negative on your cash flow and you think things could come down, it might be time, might not be the right time for you. But don't try and time the market is really the main point. Because when you're looking at something from a 10 to 20 year horizon, it really doesn't matter. If you bought a house in 1999, like this house now that's worth, I don't know, 650, 700,000, always cash flows, has the entire time. If I bought it in 1998 for 93,000 or 98,000, it just wouldn't matter to me today. What matters is a good rental property. So if I got a better deal on a property that didn't have the extra garage, or that wasn't as easy to rent, or always had parking issues, so I always had to kind of mess around with what kind of tenant mix I had in there, it just wouldn't be as good of a property. It's not only is it good now, it's going to be good in another 10 years. Eventually, until some developer insists on overpaying me for it another 15 or 20 years from now, then I'll sell it. But until then, it's my best property, and I'm happy to have overpaid for it. So, that's my point, is that, I do think I think we're in for a rent drop. So we don't want to pretend. There's a lot of people out there, especially professionals in our industry, that will quite often just say, oh, everything's going to be great. Rents are going up, prices are going to go up. Here's why everything's going to go up next year. And there's a lot of good things to look at in Calgary, but that doesn't mean rents are always going to go up, and it doesn't mean prices are always going to go up. However, the right strategy, it doesn't really matter as much outside of the cash flow that you do need to pay attention to, because you can't miss payments. You can't get to a point where you're struggling to actually make ends meet. So you don't want to get overburdened, but outside of that, trying to time the market if you're ready to buy doesn't really make sense, and you're going to pay for it down the road. Yeah, so now moving on. So I don't want to pretend that the market is all good. So I want to, because I really, all of us are, we're pretty good at talking people out of buying bad rentals or bad strategy. And we also want to be realistic when the market's not going to boom, because it's been, 5 years of what really has only been good news in Calgary. But we think this year is going to change. And it's not going to be bad news. I think it's just going to be flat. But if you've been relying on a strategy that requires the market to continue going up, like a lot of house flippers are, then you need to be a lot more careful. And I work with a lot of house flippers too. I just don't consider it real estate investing in the same way. It's a different type of business. So we've got the best job numbers in Canada. I already kind of mentioned our diversifying economy, which is good. But one of the other important things that is really valuable to point out is the type of jobs we have. Almost all of the jobs created in the last 4 or 5 years in Canada, outside of Alberta, are public sector jobs. Meaning, like, jobs are basically made up. They didn't actually produce anything. The government just made a job, started paying someone a salary, and doesn't even have the money to pay for it. They're just borrowing it. So that has to get paid back someday. So when somebody has a private sector job, they actually produce goods and services of some kind. And then those goods and services are, then they have to pay a certain amount of taxes that go into the government's budget. And if someone has a public sector job, they produce nothing, and often they form bureaucracies that get in the way of production. I'm not saying it's unnecessary. It just means that they don't actually produce anything. So they're actually they're actually slowing production in Ontario. They make the GDP numbers look good because the GDP is growing, but it's based on a job that's created only from borrowing money that you eventually have to pay back. And that's in Alberta, our jobs are actually, adding to our economy and also to our tax base. Whereas in Ontario and BC, they're adding jobs, but they're government jobs, and those jobs actually take away from production of the job. So as that kind of levels itself out and they have to start paying back money, it's going to be rough there, which is really good for Alberta. it might be tough there. Some of the people are going to get laid off, whether they're in the civil service or even in the private sector. If things do get challenging there will be job opportunities here. And I think businesses are going to continue to move here, both internationally and even interprovincially in the same fashion they have been, because things are going to get bad, but they're going to get, as a Canada-wide, things are going to be rough. But in Alberta, we're going to be spared from a lot of that. And because we're spared from a lot of that, a lot more people will still move here. Oil and gas has not created, outside of the last 6 months, has not created any of the new jobs that we had. So the 100,000+ jobs just in Calgary that have been created in the last 4 or 5 years, almost zero of them were net oil and gas jobs. Oil and gas went up in price, which is good for royalties. And Alberta used to be, his economy was based on the expansion of the production of oil. Now it's just based on the production of oil. And we're still expanding that, but it's now incremental, kind of adding to the existing infrastructure that's already there to extract oil. So we're not building any new $12 billion projects in Fort McMurray that require a lot of labor, which was driving our economy for years. We are still getting the royalties and the tax revenue from that. So it's good overall for our government because we can keep taxes lower for both individuals, but more importantly for businesses that want to come here to help diversify our economy even further. Even though things are good here, they don't care about Alberta, whether we're doing bad or good. They just don't care about Alberta. We're just not, population-wise, not as big. We're too far away from them to think about it. All the people who make decisions in this country on the finance, all the big banks, they're all in Toronto. They're all in Ontario. And Ontario is going to suffer. They have to kind of unwind and deleverage a lot of their real estate. So they're going to keep rates low. And in fact, they're not going to deleverage it. They can't they admitted it, say, we got to increase affordability. We got to make affordability, it's getting out of hand. We need to make things more affordable, but we can't reduce prices because people are dependent on that. Well, it's like those two things don't match, but which one are they going to do? Are they going to, take people who are dependent on the net worth in their house and often leveraged up to that net worth of their house and then tell them their net worth is going to drop by $300,000 by kind of forcing that, by pulling back a lot of the things they've done to actually support prices. And, a lot of them are just how much tax revenue it takes to actually build, or tax and fees and land transfer tax, municipal, land transfer tax, provincial, all of that stuff is increased the value of properties in Toronto, and they've also restricted building very heavily, both through NIMBYism and then what they call the green belt in Toronto, which is basically they just encircled the city and said you can't build out anymore. And it's made all remaining properties more valuable, but they haven't actually made it easy to build on those properties. And they've added hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tax to all of those. So in the early 2000s, Calgary and Toronto were always going back and forth for the number 2 spot in terms of like what most expensive real estate, the average price. So it was Vancouver always number 1, Toronto and maybe shut that door. And then Toronto and Calgary were always going back and forth. And then all of a sudden, so in 2007, about the same price, within a few $1,000s of each other, and then Calgary stayed stagnant until 2022, and Toronto tripled during that same time frame. Now, our income still went up at a faster pace than Toronto's did, but Toronto's prices tripled while ours stayed at 0. So what happened? Did their houses grow? Did they get bigger? They didn't get more valuable. They actually just made it so hard to build new houses and the demand was heavy, so the existing prices went up. They don't have any intrinsic value beyond the fact that their competition is restricted. It's hard and expensive to build a new house. So you want to build a bungalow next to a 1960s bungalow in Toronto, it would cost you well over $1 million just to, buy the land, do the same, build the same old house there. So they've created that problem. That's also where they've got all their tax revenue from. So all that tax revenue has gone to supporting that civil service that has built up and created a lot of their jobs. And everyone was kind of okay with paying those extra costs because every time they moved into a house they had purchased 2 years ago from a builder, when they moved into that townhouse, it was now worth a few $100,000s more. So they were always okay with it. But now that the prices have flattened out, people are no longer going to be okay with it, and you can see that by the pre-sales. There is currently, I think, so when you look at how long it takes to build a condo, it's about 5 years. And normally there are 10,000 plus units that would already be being pre-sold and permitted to be construction for 2030. Right now there's 300. So not just to be clear, not 300,000 out of the 3 million they need in Toronto, according to the experts, to create housing affordability. There's 300 units, that's it, for the entire city of Toronto that will be completed in 2030. So the only properties under construction that are going to get built are the ones already under construction, because no investor, no homeowner is willing to go in and put a deposit down, knowing that not only they're going to have to pay these taxes built into the price, they're also going to have to pay taxes at closing, $60,000, $70,000 worth of extra taxes. But they're also seeing that some of the people that bought a few years ago and are currently taking possession of properties worth $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 less than they purchased them for. So nobody's buying pre-sales anymore. So if you can't get pre-sales, you can't build. So they're kind of in a lot of trouble, but the government will support them. The country can't afford Toronto to collapse, and certainly the people who make the decisions that live in Toronto won't let their house prices collapse and all their investments collapse. And 2/3 of Canada's economy is based on consumer spending, and consumers have been getting it by all this leverage that's been injected into the market by way of billions of dollars into the real estate market. So they can't let it collapse, which means even if inflation comes back, which I do believe that it will, they can't raise rates that much, which is good for us. So even if our market's booming, and we probably should have increasing rates for Alberta, because we're just a small cog in a big machine, they just won't care about us. They're really only going to be cared about the Ontario prices, specifically Toronto, where most of the value in mortgage lending and everything is. So what they're going to do is, inflate away that debt they have. And governments always do this. This is how governments have always gone bankrupt. But the governments will always support, so they can raise taxes, they can cut services, or they can inflate the debt away. Their favorite one is inflating it, because you can't raise taxes enough. It would just crush the economy, and you'd have to double everybody's taxes for years to pay off the debt that we've been incurring. Or you'd have to cut services to the point of, even if you shut down every hospital in the country, it would take years still to pay off this debt we've incurred. So the only other way to do it is to inflate it away. So if they create 20% of inflation, it's basically making the value of all of our dollars 20% less, including the debt that the government owes. So when there's 20% inflation happens, they print 20% more money, which they've done more than that in the last few years. They've actually paid off 20% of the debt without having to pay off anything. So the government was doing that for a while, and it worked because rates were coming down. So it was offsetting the expenses people were feeling. But now the problem is the inflation got so out of hand that people started getting upset about it. So now we've noticed, and because rates have now 2.5 times, and we still have a good, I'd say 50%, not numerically, but the amount. So the 2020, 2021, part of 2022, those were the biggest mortgages ever taken by typically young families that are the biggest consumer spenders, and they're about to have their interest rates go up by 2.5 times. So their 1.59 over the next 2 years is going to convert over to a 4.2 if rates stay where they are or even go lower. They're assuming they can still make the payments. They'll do so by not spending that money in the economy. And with 2/3 of our economy being consumer spending, it's going to hurt. So they're going to have stimulus measures like keeping rates low and even participating in the bond market to keep fixed rates low. So I think that we're going to have a lot of inflation in Canada in the next few years, but that's good for real estate. Now, it can hurt if you're redoing your mortgage right at the time when inflation's high and they're trying to combat it. But at the same time, just like the government has its debt and wants to inflate away the value of it, if you go buy real estate and you leverage it, someone else actually pays for the leverage of it through the rent they pay, pays for the interest that you're paying, and then your debt is devaluing. Now, the way that manifests itself in our numbers is, we call it appreciation. But really what's happening is the house price is going up with the value of everything else. It's just a numerical number. The house price isn't actually growing, it's just doubling in price. But what doesn't double with that is the debt that you borrowed. That actually is just shrinking in terms of its actual value. So when you're paying back the lender in inflationary times, you're paying them back with less and less valuable dollars. And they don't care about it because they've already made that money in the interest rate. And you don't really care about the interest rate because the tenant's actually the one paying it. And tenants don't negotiate based on a time value of money projecting into the future in terms of inflation and monetary policy. So it's just one of those things where real estate, when you know that you're going to have inflation, it's not just inflation proof, it's actually enhanced by inflation because of the leverage. Doesn't mean you don't have to be careful about your cash flow. It just means that inflation is actually really good for real estate. So I'm not saying it's actually awful for some people. That's why we have record numbers of people at food banks. It's not a good thing, but we can almost count on it happening because they have no way out except to inflate a good portion of the value of that debt away. International students is one of the other things that's, the students coming into Canada, they set up those storefronts that had 10,000 students in them. And they were actually just like 300 square foot storefronts in strip malls, and they were universities. And all they were was a tricky way to get people to apply through student visas, and had some online courses so they could apply for their residency. And so the government, the federal government has said, okay, we're reassessing all this, and we're going to be allotting how many students each province can get. So Ontario, big cut in half, BC, big cuts. In Alberta, we have a 30% increase because we didn't have any of those storefronts. Our universities and colleges were actually bringing in people that were actually taking real education. So we're likely, for those who still want to come into Canada and want to do so through a student visa, we're going to be one of the only places that can actually do that. I think some of the maritime provinces have a bit, but even with an increase, the number is so low that it won't really have an impact. So the Trump tariffs, this one's scaring a lot of people. This one doesn't scare me at all, actually. Even if he tried to implement that, even for a short term, like even if he said, I'm going to do it for 2 months to really punish the whole country, which, he might, as a negotiator, he might do that. But 25% in oil and gas, the way it works with oil and gas and the way futures work is a 25% tariff would immediately raise gas prices significantly in the Midwest states, which were all the swing states that just voted for Trump. He can't afford to lose those. The Republicans can't afford to lose those. So that his number one thing that he said everywhere is, I am going to reduce energy prices. I'm going to cut them in half. If the first thing he does increases their prices because of a direct result of a policy he's implemented, it just looks bad, it wears bad. So he's probably going to exempt our oil and gas, which is largely our exports, to the US. So not only that, our premier, lover, hater, has been doing a great job for the last, couple of years, especially in the last year, of building relationships with Republican governors and the entire energy industry. So she's basically like the 13th state in the 13 state energy producing, energy kind of important states. And she's built a really good relationship with them. So she's got the ear of the Republican Party at all angles. She's done nothing but things that Trump will like. And then on top of it, it's just logistically not possible for him. There are certain things that take 6 months to actually play out. Energy prices would be immediate. If there was a 25% tax, within a week, gasoline prices at the pump will have skyrocketed in those Midwest states where a lot of our oil passes through and is refined in. So it's very unlikely, even if he did try to do that, that it would last longer than a few days before he would start paying a political price for it. So I think it's pretty unlikely that will happen. Multifamily, did you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, let's cover the changes. Okay, so briefly wanted to talk about the MLI Select program. So for those who are not familiar with it, MLI Select is a commercial multifamily product that is typically used for new construction, although you can use it for existing buildings as well. It only works for units that are five plus units. It's been pretty popular over the last year, and there have been some changes that were introduced by CMHC as of mid-November. So I just wanted to highlight those changes in case you're considering buying something with using the MLI Select program. The first thing is they're reducing the leverage during construction using a rental achievement holdback. So essentially, before this change came into effect, you could put a 5% deposit down with the builder, and CMHC would essentially finance the 95% of the construction. That's no longer the case, so they're cutting it down to somewhere in the 80 to 85% leverage during the construction, and you can only top it up to your 95% loan to value at the end of construction once you meet the rental achievement. So you have to essentially lease up your units or show that you can be rented at current market rents. Which brings us to a second point. So you need to lease up to convert your construction loan to your permanent loan prior to purchasing a newly constructed building with MLI Select. If, say, you were underwritten at X rents, and by the time construction's done, say a year down the road, you're no longer able to meet those rents because the market has changed, rents are coming down like what we're seeing right now, your loan to value might be reduced by CMHC, or they'll just underwrite the whole deal again. In that case, then you might have to top up your down payment because you still have your original commitment to the builder to close on the purchase. One alternative to this, if you can't lease up your units or you're having a hard time, is you can get a bridge loan, but that comes with additional costs. You'll have often lender fees for that bridge loan to close, and then you'll have to lease it and then apply for MLI Select, so you can have double costs by going down that route. So just a word of caution for anyone who's considering MLI Select. It's going to be a lot harder to get 95% loan to value moving forward. So if you are looking into this project with the intent of leveraging up to 95%, feel free to come and have a chat with us, because it would have to run the numbers on each project that we send you and assess the viability of it based on the rents. And like Layne was saying earlier, we often get pro formas from builders. However, we like to run our own numbers to make sure that the numbers are actually going to work and you'll cash flow when the time comes for you to take possession.
And at current prices.
Yeah, and at current prices.
Yeah, this is where I say maybe wait. I talk about saying you shouldn't wait, though this isn't necessarily the right strategy for all time, I do think single-family houses with basement suites or something simple for cash flow is, or duplexes with basement suites. This is one where waiting might be a good idea, because there are thousands of these going to be hitting the market at the same time, and it's going to create a problem just in the absorption of those units all being rented at the same time, including then how those are going to be underwritten based on the income approach and CMHC's numbers. Yeah, and it's a good point. We are actually seeing a lot of inventory come up with the MLI eligible inventory come up on the market now. I'd say about 6 months ago, if you asked us, hey, do you have any projects that we could buy? I'd say, sorry, I have none, because there was nothing. Everything was getting snapped up by investors. Right now, rents are coming down, so builders are becoming a lot more cautious, and construction costs hasn't really changed, so they're getting a lot more hesitant to even start building because they're not getting the commitment from the buyer either. So I think right now we have kind of a period where maybe we have a bit of oversupply of MLI products, and then I think that supply is going to start to dwindle on the new housing start side. Yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to building these, often it's a 2-year time horizon by the time you actually tear the house down, then apply for the rents, because they changed that rule a while ago too. You actually have to tear the house down first, then start doing your applications. Well, what if the numbers don't work in the end and you can't get your qualifying? Well, now you kind of have to finish out that project now. You're committed. So the build time is anywhere from 18 to 24 months from the time one of these, even just a simple, fourplex with basement suites, you're looking at 18 to 24 months. So people might look at the numbers now and go, you know what, we're not doing that anymore. And we're finding a lot of people are trying to run the numbers going, yeah, those numbers don't make sense.
Yeah.
But there are still thousands under construction in terms of units. I'd say well into the thousands of units that are currently under construction. They're all identical, a lot of them in similar areas, and are going to be hitting the market at the same time. And it's likely going to cause a disruption in rents, even while they get absorbed.
Yeah.
So just to have an idea, okay, so MLI is select product, right, that is coming to the market. But for the most part, what are you seeing? Like regularly, small multifamily, maybe 6 units, 8 units, or
units?
Where are you seeing that potential oversupply?
Yeah, I think most of the oversupply is probably going to come in that 6 to 8 unit range. Typically what you can build on a 50 by 120 type lot, where there's lots of projects under construction. And we actually have quite a bit of inventory of MLI products right now. But the problem is the numbers are getting harder and harder to make sense because the rents are going down. So we're trying to account for that. But at the same time, the builders are not willing to drop the purchase price because otherwise they don't get their profit margin. So they're saying, okay, well, if we don't get this price, we're not going to start construction. And we're saying, well, if we can't get this rent, then it doesn't make sense because it doesn't cash flow. So we're kind of in that weird space right now. So,
and what's been weird is that people have been ignoring numbers for a while because the financing was so attractive. You could put 5% down, and then because that wouldn't make sense to actually make the cash flow work on a commercial project, they made it a 50 and then 55-year amortization because they're really trying to encourage people in Toronto to make this work. But the problem is that the prohibitive aspects of it, like lowering, keeping affordable rent, is already low what our market rent is and our prices associated with that. So it's been so attractive for people, not because of the long-term sustainability of the actual project, because of the financing they could get. So the market was driven by financing, which always ends up leading to a glut. These changes make me very happy because it's really going to kind of cut. People are going to have to start paying attention to the numbers a lot earlier.
Yeah.
And I don't think the numbers work for a while. So I think we'll probably see a halt in these projects in Calgary for a little while because the numbers don't make sense. So now, again, we're still going to have to deal with the inventory that's going to hit the market, but I still think there's a lot of net migration to the city that's going to absorb a lot of that as well. So I only found out about this. Apparently it happened in November. You guys found out last week and just told me. So, but this is a really, really good thing, these changes they've made to really force people to look at the numbers instead of the financing, because I think that was a big risk out there.
Yeah, and I really like the fact that they're requiring you to lease it up because then the numbers are viable and they're going to adjust the LTV accordingly. And that's going to allow you to reassess your cash flow as well, right? But what's more important is just be conservative when you run your numbers today, especially if you're considering buying it, because you're probably going to be closing about a year out, right? So
yes, those concerns that you have about rents coming down, do you see everywhere or mainly in the core where most of these projects will be built? Where do you see that problem?
So far, rents are coming across the board, but the suburbs, like the newer communities, are being hit harder than the older communities. And the older communities have also seen rent drops. For example, I've got a couple of units right now actually in Bowness that are vacant, and they are harder to rent right now, and I've been cutting prices on those. So, and part of why it's taking longer in those areas is lots of new build supply coming up as well with the infills, right? There's lots of, Bowness is one of the hot spots for MLI select projects. I think seeing Mount Pleasant, Capitol Hill, and Glenbrook, I believe, is the other one, has the highest RCG applications for 8-plex construction. So some of those areas are going to be hit harder with rent drops as well. And then depends on how many apartment buildings or condos are being constructed in that area. For example, if you go to like Brentwood, they're building those towers by the university, and in Dalhousie, they're building apartment complexes there. All of that is adding supply as well, pushing rents down. So,
I mean, eventually it'll dissipate through everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously there's it's going to hit Bowness hard because someone needs to live in Bowness. Now they have way more options, but a lot of people drive and they just need to go downtown or they work out of the city. Those people are going to have the option to go somewhere else. So it'll eventually impact everything, but it's certainly, and then in brand new communities, because now builders are building houses with basement suites everywhere. Every new like community has so many of these houses that they're not really great for rent because you don't have any parking out front. You got your double car garage driveway, and then you got 4 feet of lawn, and then your neighbor's driveway, and so on. Like there's not a lot of space for parking. And then they've got these suites here, so that people have. But so if you don't have a spot for parking, then where do you park? Or you can't park, or you have to take transit. Well, good luck getting anywhere from, Legacy or Seton in under 2 hours. Like it's not like you're not next to a rapid bus route. You're not next to kind of interconnected transit. You're not really close to anything. So unless you happen to work or live in that neighborhood, it's tough. But of course, as all those units are finished and people are renting, the rents are dropping. We saw those because they were renting like $1,800 for a 480 square foot basement suite.
Yeah.
It was insane what rents were going for. And now what are they like? $1,250, like
$1,300 give or take for those tiny 499 square feet basement suites.
Yeah, so they're getting crushed specifically in the new communities. And so I think we'll see it across the board a little bit. Again, if you went into a coma in January of 2023 and you woke up right now, you'd be pumped at how high rents are, right? And they're just going to go back to where they were. And if you went into a coma in 2020 and woke up now, it would be madness how crazy high rents are. Yeah. So it's all a bit relative. Plus, with rates coming down, even if you're going to eat a year and a half until your next renewal, or you're in a fixed rate but variable, your principal pay down is going to be a lot more, even if your cash flow is negative $50 a month. So it'll work itself out over the long term. So I'm still buying, just buying, and I kind of buy for a good price. I just always buy for a good property. I kind of don't care about what my current rents are. I buy for a good property, long term, and obviously rents come into play. Like I don't want a property that I'm never going to make money on, even if it's a property that is good for future value. So,
any other questions? Yeah.
From your guys' level, what are you kind of seeing in terms of the, let's say, immigration trends within Alberta, right? With 2024 market, is probably driven by a lot of BC, Ontario sort of kind of folks moving into our province, and I'm sure probably on the realtor side, probably have a lot of clients, from those markets looking for properties.
Yeah. So we have definitely noticed a shift in that kind of buyer pool. So I'd say 2023, about 70% of our clients were basically out of province, and some of them we've never even met. So we've only FaceTimed them. And this year, 2024, I'd say it's more around 30 to 40% at most out of province pools, and it's mostly locals who are coming back into the market. So,
yeah, to be specific, being investor focused. Yeah. Most clients find you online as they're looking to invest. So that's dried up. That doesn't mean people aren't still moving here for other reasons. So the net migration is still quite positive to Alberta. And for some of the reasons I mentioned about, I think, Ontario heading into a couple of really rocky years, I think that's going to continue. So economists are saying it's still going to be net positive in Alberta, but not as crazy as it was. And I would agree with that, except I actually think they might be underestimating how rough it might actually be in some areas where people might want to start moving from here as well. So
yeah, and I think part of what's causing that shift in demographic for us is also Ontario prices being hit a bit harder. So a lot of them used to refinance and take their money out and bring it here, but now that's getting harder, right? So they're not able to refinance to that same extent. So they're limited by capital of what they can bring here. So yeah.
So regarding the multiplex, so right now they changed the policy, we have to put 20%, right?
For MLI Select?
Yes.
Not necessarily. It depends on what you end up with at the end.
So if MLI is like $3 million for an 8-plex, and if you have to put 200,000, is it ideal to pay off an existing home that is 400,000 and get a pure cash flow of $2,000, which will eventually appreciate at least 100,000 next year? We are saving 25,000 interest for the whole year. So is it better to pay off your home or put in an MLI listing for 8 plex or 4 plex?
I would say you're convoluting two different questions, I think, which is like it's one question, but I think there are actually two different answers. I guess is you know how I mentioned that inflation is something that is actually appreciation is really inflation, right? Which is just the value of everything going up except the debt. So if you're not leveraged, you're not using that, right? So you're like the idea is that you want to be able to get as much real estate as you can. Yeah. So if you buy, so you might be able to buy 4 properties for the same amount that you could buy one MLI Select for, one commercial 20% down if it ends up being that in the end, which is probably what it's going to end up at. I think people are going to end up being able to finance even an MLI Select product, but it's going to be 20%, like based on where build costs are, unless they'll start coming down as well, which I think they'll have to at some point.
Eventually, yeah.
So if your option is buying 4 single family houses on 6,000 square foot lots, and 24,000 square feet of land, all that's appreciating, and land is the part of real estate that goes up, versus one 6,000 square foot lot there's an 8-plex on. And I'd say argue right now the cash flow might even be better on the 4 lots than it would be on the MLI, like the commercial 8-plex.
I would say so as well.
Yeah.
If you bought
So
4 separate lots, it'd probably cash flow better than one 8-plex. But it's more of a long-term play if you buy the 8-plex.
It's a little more hands-off. Yeah. There is something to be said about like having an 8-plex. You just hire a property manager, go deal with it. You lose obviously some of the cash flow, which you won't have in the first place because of the current rents. Yeah. But buying 4 single-family houses, it's 24,000 square feet. So the next time there's a boom and developers want to build multiplexes on properties, now you've got 4 to sell. Right? Whereas you're not going to tear down your 8-plex to build another 8-plex. So buying more land, like depending on where you're at, if you've just inherited $38 million from your grandfather, yeah, you want to go, get into commercial real estate. It's easy. But if you're trying to if you've got, saving up, just from your own savings or refinancing your house, the better way to leverage is in single family houses, because that's how you get the biggest chunk of land, especially if you buy it in an older neighborhood, which is not at highest and best use. Now, a bungalow in, Bowness or Highland Park is not at highest and best use, right? So you've got that capacity to change the use and really get more value out of it, whereas the 8-plex has already had the use changed. So you've actually, like when you're doing it, if you're buying a property and putting an 8-plex on it, you're actually just becoming a developer, except you're not a developer. So you're not gonna be as good as a developer actually doing it. Like that's the reason I've never developed, in spite of the fact that we're kind of doing one now, but we're doing it because we're forcing the value out of it. I don't want to be a developer, but in order to force the most value out of our property, our 3, like we had actually 6 lots, in order to actually get the most value out of them, we have to redevelop them into what will be 6 lots into 64 unit townhouses with MLI Select product. But even that, I'm probably pushing back because the numbers still make sense right now. And because they're the right type of property, I cash flow on them. My holding period is forever. So go ahead.
With the change of the rules, how long can people amortize over when they get the CMHC loan?
I believe it's the same, right?
It's the same.
Just the qualifying is
Just
a
the
little
qualifying,
different.
yeah.
And if the qualifying is so much harder, it might bring down the buying value. As less people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we
100%,
do
yeah.
anticipate those prices will start coming down, but whether builders will build depends on construction costs as well, whether it's viable for them to take on that risk of building. So
I think what's going to happen is that it's going to go back to market driven. This MLI Select product was so over
financing driven.
Financing driven, not driven by the market. Again, government intervening in a market in a different way because they've intervened in the market in, across the country in a bunch of different ways with regulations and extra fees and cost and rent control. They don't have enough rentals being built. So now they intervene to compensate for that with a product that doesn't make any sense. But then of course, we get it here too, because it's a national program through CMHC. These policies were probably them recognizing like, oh, wait a second, there's some holes in this. We want to get this corrected to make sure that we don't, because the last thing they want is a whole bunch of properties going into foreclosure that they have to take. Which is what I was actually predicting was like, I was thinking there's going to be, hundreds of these units that are going to go into foreclosure. People aren't going to be able to manage the upside down cash flow or find investors. They're going to end up walking away, and CMHC is going to be left holding hundreds of units and selling them at 60 cents on the dollar. This, I think, will correct that before it gets too bad.
Any other questions?
Is there seasonality in rent prices? Like, I know house prices are seasonality.
100%.
There's definitely a seasonality in rent prices. Typically, they go down a little bit in the winter and they come back up. Spring's usually the peak rental season, so rents are typically slightly higher. But this seems a bit, sorry?
What's the variance? Like, how much would you usually expect, like, winter to be compared to spring?
Typically, like 5 to 10% drop in price in the winter, December, January.
And a lot of
it's worse,
it's just that you can't find the tenant because nobody wants to move in the middle of winter. So you lose a tenant because whatever reason they have to go, and then you're trying to rent and just rent for December 1st. It's snowing. Nobody wants to look at houses. Certainly nobody wants to move. Then if you don't get ordered by December 1st, then it's like, well, now nobody's going to try and rent over Christmas, and then in January everything's covered in snow. So you're like, you know what? I'm just going to drop my rent to get this thing over with because I don't like. And I've
keep a vacant property.
Been doing this for
winter.
20 years with a lot of property. I hate vacancy. And if you catch me like now, like I'm doing it, it's like August 31st. I renew everything then. Now, logistically, that becomes challenging if you don't have property management help and everything else after a handful of properties. That's just easiest for me and my schedule in my summers and everything else. So I typically like to do that. But so it doesn't matter. I never like go, okay, 12-month lease, because then I have the same problem next year. It's just a pain. So yeah, definitely seasonality. Really good question, because those rents, I guess, do actually take that into consideration. But even when you can compare them seasonally, this year's rents have dropped and still hard to rent. Whereas last year it was a little harder to rent, but I don't think the rent, like I didn't have to actually drop rent. I didn't have a lineup of 34 people like I'd had over the last couple of years.
Yeah, same time last year, you didn't have to drop the rents, but you had less applicants. So you could still rent it out, it just took a bit longer to find that right person. So whereas this year, it's a noticeable difference in how long it's taking to rent. Like Layne was saying, he's actually had a vacant unit for over a month, right?
Yeah.
And so will I, because I have a vacant unit right now. So, yeah, it's just the way the market is. So, but it helps that interest rates are also coming down, so the variable rate mortgage kind of buffers that out a bit. So,
So I think we could. I mean, there's